Elena's hands shook as the rope bit into her wrists, and she pressed her son tighter against her chest, feeling his tiny heartbeat race against her own. Wolf was barely 6 months old, too young to understand why strangers were shouting numbers at his mother, too young to know that in a few minutes, he might be pulled from her arms forever. The night air smelled of smoke and fear, and the crowd around her pressed closer, eyes hungry, voices sharp with greed. "Move along, girl," a guard barked, shoving her forward into a line of trembling women. Some clutched pups of their own, others stood empty-handed, having already lost what they came with. Elena's stomach turned. She had heard whispers about this place for years. Dark rumors passed between omegas and hushed voices late at night. Stories about a market hidden beneath the old grain mill, where desperate mothers were forced to give up their children to pay debts they never agreed to owe. She had always prayed she would never see it with her own eyes. Now she stood in the middle of it, and there was no waking up from this nightmare. 3 days earlier, her life had still been hard, but it had been hers. She lived alone on the edge of the Ashwood territory, in a crumbling cabin that leaked when it rained, and creaked when the wind blew too hard. She was an omega without a pack, cast out after her mate had died, and left her with a child no one else wanted to claim. The pack elders called her cursed. They said a woman who could not keep a mate brought shame to her bloodline. She endured their scorn because she had no other choice, and because every night when she looked at Wolf's small sleeping face, she remembered why she kept going. Then Garrick came. He was one of the enforcers from her old pack, a broad-shouldered man with cold eyes and a colder heart, and he arrived at her door with 2 other men flanking him like shadows. He did not knock, he simply pushed the door open and stepped inside, as though he already owned the place. "Your mother left a debt," he said, tossing a folded paper onto her table. "Unpaid for 12 years. Now it falls to you." Elena stared at the paper without touching it. "I don't have money, Garrick. You know that. I barely have food." "Then you'll pay another way." His eyes flicked toward the corner of the room, toward the small basket where Wolf lay sleeping, wrapped in a blanket she had sewn herself from old scraps of cloth. "There's a market. They pay well for healthy pups. One transaction, and your family's debt disappears." The words hit her like a physical blow. For a moment she could not breathe, could not speak, could only stare at him in horror, as the meaning of his words sank into her bones. "No," she whispered, then louder, "No, never. I will not sell my son." Garrick's jaw tightened. "You misunderstand me. This isn't a request." He nodded to the men behind him, and one stepped forward and picked up the basket, before Elena could stop him. She screamed and lunged, but Garrick caught her by the arm, holding her back with a strength she had no hope of matching. "You have 3 days," he said, his voice flat and final. "Bring the pup to the market yourself, or we take him from you the hard way. Either way, the debt gets paid." They left as quickly as they had come, taking nothing that night, but leaving behind a threat that would not lift no matter how she tried to shake it. Elena spent the following 3 days searching for any way out. She went to neighbors who had once been kind to her, begging for a loan, for work, for anything that might buy her more time. Doors closed in her face. Word had already spread that she was marked by the pack elders, and no one wanted to risk their own standing by helping a woman they had labeled cursed. She thought about running. She packed a small bag, wrapped Wolf in every blanket she owned, and made it as far as the tree line before the howls started behind her. Distant, but growing closer. The sound of trackers, who had clearly been sent to watch her every move. She turned back before they found her, understanding with a sinking heart that there truly was no escape. The pack had eyes everywhere, and a lone omega with an infant could not outrun trained wolves through unfamiliar territory. On the 3rd night, Garrick returned, and this time she did not fight him when he told her to walk. There was nothing left to fight with. She held Wolf against her chest the entire way, whispering soft words to him even though he was too young to understand, telling him that she loved him, that she would find a way to protect him, that whatever happened tonight would not be the end of their story. She did not fully believe her own words, but she needed to say them anyway, if only to keep her own heart from shattering completely. The market itself was worse than anything she had imagined. It operated in the ruins of an old grain mill just outside the boundary between 2 territories, a location chosen deliberately because it fell into no pack's direct jurisdiction, making it easier for the organizers to avoid consequences. Torches lit the space in flickering orange light, casting long shadows across rows of makeshift stalls and a raised wooden platform at the center, where the actual bidding took place. Elena had heard that wealthy alphas came from all over the region to bid on pups here, some seeking heirs they could not conceive themselves, others seeking something far more troubling that she refused to let her mind dwell on. She was pushed into a line with 6 other women, all of them holding pups or young children, all of them wearing the same hollow, defeated expression that she suspected mirrored her own. A woman beside her, older, with silver threaded through her dark hair, glanced at Wolf, and then at Elena with something like pity. "First time?" the woman asked quietly. Elena nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "It's easier if you don't look at their faces once the bidding starts," the woman said. "The buyers, I mean. Just don't look at them." "Have you done this before?" Elena managed to ask. The woman's eyes dropped to the ground. "Twice." She did not explain further, and Elena did not ask. She understood enough from the single word to know that this woman had already lost 2 children to this terrible market, and was now waiting to see if a third would be taken as well. The unfairness of it burned through Elena's veins like fire, and for the first time since Garrick had arrived at her door, something other than fear began to stir inside her. Anger. A raw, helpless anger at a system that preyed on the weakest and most desperate, that treated mothers and children as nothing more than goods, to be exchanged for silence about old debts. Garrick stood near the platform, arms crossed, watching the line with the satisfied expression of a man who believed his job was already done. He caught Elena's eye once and gave her a small, cruel smile, as though her suffering meant nothing more to him than a task successfully completed. She looked away before her anger could turn into something reckless. The auctioneer, a thin man with a reedy voice and sharp, calculating eyes, called the first woman forward. Elena watched in silent horror as the woman's child, a boy who could not have been older than 2, was lifted onto the platform while numbers were shouted from the crowd. The mother stood frozen, tears streaming silently down her face, as strangers decided her son's fate in a matter of minutes. When the gavel fell, a well-dressed man stepped forward to claim the boy, and the mother collapsed to her knees, sobbing, until guards dragged her away to make room for the next in line. Elena's grip on Wolf tightened until her knuckles turned white. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything except stand here and wait for her turn to lose everything that mattered to her. But there was nowhere to run, and no one to hear her scream who would actually help. 2 more women were called forward. 2 more children were lifted onto the platform. 2 more hearts broke in the flickering torchlight, while the crowd murmured and bid, and treated the entire scene as though it were nothing more than an ordinary market day. Elena felt herself growing numb, her mind retreating somewhere far away from her body as she waited for her name to be called, bracing herself for the moment when Wolf would be taken from her arms. She did not notice, in her haze of terror, the tall figure standing near the back of the crowd, hood pulled low over his face, watching everything with sharp, careful eyes that missed nothing. He had been there for nearly an hour already, observing the operation with the quiet patience of a predator studying its prey, cataloging every face, every transaction, every piece of evidence that would matter later. He had heard rumors of this market for months, whispers that had reached even his own well-guarded halls, and he had come tonight to see the truth with his own eyes, before deciding how to respond. What he had not expected was to feel his chest tighten at the sight of a young woman near the front of the line, clutching an infant so small it could barely be more than a few months old, her face a mask of terror that she was clearly fighting to control for the sake of the child in her arms. There was something in the way she held herself, some quiet, desperate dignity beneath the fear, that made him watch her more closely than any of the others. "Next," the auctioneer called, and Elena's stomach dropped as she realized her turn had finally come. Garrick's hand closed around her arm, guiding her forward toward the platform with a grip that left no room for hesitation. She stumbled once, catching herself before she fell, and held Wolf even tighter against her chest as the crowd's eyes turned toward her. "An Omega pup," the auctioneer announced, reading from a slip of paper Garrick had apparently handed him earlier. "Healthy, strong lungs, good bloodline on the mother's side, despite recent circumstances." Laughter rippled through parts of the crowd at the cruel joke embedded in his words, and Elena felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, even as her heart pounded with terror. She looked down at Wolf's small face, memorizing every detail, the curve of his nose, the softness of his dark hair, the way his tiny fingers curled around the edge of his blanket. She wanted this image burned into her memory forever, in case it was the last time she ever held him. "Bring the child forward," the auctioneer said, gesturing impatiently. Elena's feet felt rooted to the floor. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to fight, to do anything except hand her son over to strangers. But 2 guards stood on either side of the platform, and Garrick's presence loomed just behind her, and she knew with sickening certainty that resistance would only make things worse for both of them. "Please," she whispered, so quietly that only the auctioneer could hear her. "Please, just a moment more." The auctioneer's expression flickered with something almost like impatience, mixed with a trace of discomfort, quickly masked. "The bidding will begin shortly. Step forward." Elena closed her eyes, pressed one final kiss to the top of Wolf's head, and forced her feet to move toward the edge of the platform, feeling as though she were walking toward the edge of a cliff with no ground beneath her feet, only empty air and the terrible certainty of a fall she could not stop. Behind her, unnoticed in the shifting crowd, the hooded figure who had been watching all night finally moved from his position near the back wall, stepping quietly closer to the platform, with the deliberate calm of a man who had already decided what he was about to do. The auctioneer raised his hand, ready to call for the opening bid, and Elena felt the world narrow down to the small warm weight of Wolf against her chest, and the terrible silence that stretched out in front of her like an open grave. She did not look at the crowd. She could not bring herself to see the faces of people who might soon own her son. Instead, she stared at a single point on the platform floor, a dark knot in the old wood, and tried to hold herself together through sheer will alone. "We will start the bidding at 200, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying easily through the hushed crowd. A hand rose near the front. 200. Another voice called out, before the first bid had even settled. 300. Elena's ears rang. The numbers meant nothing to her, only the sickening reality that somewhere in this crowd, a stranger was about to decide the price of her son's life, and pay it as easily as buying a length of cloth or a sack of grain. She pressed her lips to Wolf's forehead one more time, memorizing the smell of him, the soft sound of his breathing, preparing herself for the moment the guards would step forward to take him from her arms. 400, called a third voice, and this time, there was an edge of excitement in it, the thrill of competition overtaking any thought of what was actually being purchased. Garrick stood nearby with his arms crossed, watching the rising numbers with open satisfaction, as though every increase in price were a personal victory. Elena hated him in that moment more fiercely than she had ever hated anyone in her life, hated the cold indifference in his eyes, hated that he could stand there and watch a mother's heart break without a flicker of remorse crossing his face. 500, came another bid, and the auctioneer's eyes lit up at the growing sum. Elena felt her knees begin to buckle. She locked them in place through sheer stubbornness, refusing to collapse in front of this crowd, refusing to give them the satisfaction of watching her fall apart completely. If this was truly happening, if there was truly nothing she could do to stop it, then she would at least stand tall while it happened. She owed Wolf that much, even if she could give him nothing else. 600, the auctioneer called, pointing toward a well-dressed man near the front who had raised his hand with obvious eagerness. It was at that exact moment that a new voice cut through the crowd, low and calm, carrying an authority that silenced every other sound in the room almost instantly. "I'll take the entire market." For a long moment, nobody moved. The auctioneer blinked, clearly uncertain he had heard correctly. "I'm sorry, sir. Could you repeat that?" The hooded figure stepped forward from where he had been standing near the edge of the crowd, and as he moved into the torchlight, murmurs began rippling outward through the gathered buyers and sellers, whispers of recognition spreading like wildfire. He lowered his hood, revealing sharp features, dark hair, and eyes the color of deep amber that seemed to catch the firelight and hold it. Elena did not recognize him at first, too consumed by her own terror to place the face, but the reaction of the crowd told her everything she needed to know. People were stepping back. Guards who had been lounging near the platform straightened immediately, their postures shifting from casual authority to nervous alertness. "I said," the man repeated, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the room without needing to be raised, "that I am purchasing this entire market. Every stall, every contract, every debt recorded here tonight. All of it belongs to me as of this moment." "Alpha King," someone whispered near the front, and the words spread through the crowd like a current, repeated in hushed, shocked tones. Elena's head snapped up at the title, her heart lurching in her chest. She had heard stories of Killian Ashford her entire life, the most powerful alpha in the region, a man whose territory bordered nearly a dozen smaller packs, and whose word carried the weight of law across an area larger than most kingdoms. She had never imagined she would see him in person, and certainly never imagined she would see him here, in this terrible place, in this terrible moment. The auctioneer's composure cracked entirely. "Your Majesty, this is a private establishment. I don't believe you have the authority to simply—" "I have exactly the authority I need," Killian said, and though his voice remained calm, there was an unmistakable edge beneath it now, a warning that only a fool would ignore. "This market operates within the boundaries I control. Every person here tonight has been trading in the suffering of Omegas and their children, and every person here tonight will answer for it, starting with you." Two of his own guards, who Elena now realized had been standing quietly among the crowd all along, disguised as ordinary attendees, stepped forward and flanked the auctioneer before he could attempt to flee. Chaos began to ripple outward through the gathered crowd as people realized the severity of what was happening, some attempting to slip toward the exits, only to find more of Killian's men already stationed there, blocking every path. Garrick's face had gone pale. He took a step back from Elena, as though putting distance between them might somehow protect him from whatever was about to happen. Elena barely noticed him at all anymore. Her entire attention was fixed on the Alpha King as he walked calmly across the platform, his amber eyes sweeping over the frightened women and their children still waiting in line, softening slightly, with something that looked almost like sorrow, before hardening again into cold resolve. "Every debt recorded in this market's ledgers is dissolved, effective immediately," Killian announced, his voice ringing out across the stunned silence. "Every child scheduled for sale tonight will be returned to their mother. Anyone who attempts to interfere with that order will answer to me personally." A ripple of disbelief passed through the line of women. The silver-haired woman standing near Elena let out a choked sob, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth, as though she could not quite believe what she was hearing. Elena herself felt frozen, unable to process the sudden shift from utter despair to something that almost resembled hope, afraid that if she allowed herself to believe it, the moment would shatter and prove to be nothing more than a cruel trick. Killian's gaze moved across the platform and landed on Elena, and for a moment, something passed between them that she could not name, a recognition of shared understanding, though they had never met before tonight. He did not smile. His expression remained serious, almost grim, but there was a gentleness in the way he looked at her, and at Wolf, that told her, without words, that she had nothing left to fear from him. "You," he said, addressing the auctioneer again, his voice dropping into something colder and more dangerous than before. "Who arranged the sale of this particular child?" The auctioneer's eyes darted toward Garrick, who had gone rigid, clearly hoping to escape notice entirely. Killian followed the man's gaze and studied Garrick for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Name," Killian said simply. "Garrick," the auctioneer stammered, eager to shift blame away from himself. "He's an enforcer from the Ashwood pack. Brought her in himself. Said there was an old debt to settle." Killian's eyes narrowed slightly as he turned his full attention toward Garrick, and Elena watched the enforcer's confident posture crumble under the weight of that gaze. "An old debt," Killian repeated slowly. "And how, exactly, does a debt owed by a woman's mother become payment demanded in the form of an infant child?" Garrick opened his mouth, then closed it again, apparently unable to find words that would not incriminate him further. "I thought as much," Killian said quietly. He turned to two of his guards. "Detain him. He'll answer for this, along with everyone else who profited from tonight's proceedings." The guards moved swiftly, seizing Garrick by both arms before he could attempt to flee. He struggled briefly, shouting something about pack authority and jurisdiction, but his protest died quickly under the weight of Killian's unwavering stare. Within moments, he was led away, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by the same fear he had once inflicted so casually on others. Elena remained frozen at the edge of the platform, still holding Wolf against her chest, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and cautious, fragile hope. She had come here tonight prepared to lose everything, and instead she found herself standing in the wreckage of a market that had just been dismantled before her eyes by the single most powerful man in the region. Killian approached her slowly, his expression softening slightly as he drew closer, though he kept a respectful distance, clearly aware of how frightened and overwhelmed she must be. "You're safe now," he said quietly, his voice gentler than she would have expected from someone who had just commanded a room full of powerful people into stunned silence. "No one is going to take your son from you tonight." Elena's legs finally gave out beneath her, and she sank to her knees on the platform, clutching Wolf, and sobbing with a relief so overwhelming it felt almost like pain. Killian did not reach for her, did not try to comfort her with a touch she had not invited, but he remained close, a steady, quiet presence while she wept, allowing her the space to feel everything she had been forcing herself to suppress for the past 3 days. Around them, the market continued to dissolve into chaos, guards rounding up organizers and buyers alike, other mothers embracing their children with the same disbelieving joy that Elena felt coursing through her own veins. The nightmare that had brought her here was ending, but as she looked up at the Alpha King standing quietly beside her, she could not help but wonder what price might eventually come with a rescue this significant, and whether she would ever truly be free of debts owed to powerful men. The guards escorted Elena away from the ruined market before dawn, though escorted was perhaps too gentle a word for what actually happened. Killian himself walked beside her through the dispersing crowd, his presence alone enough to part the remaining onlookers, like water, before a ship's bow. Elena kept Wolf pressed tightly against her chest, still trembling from everything that had happened, still only half believing that she was walking away from that platform with her son still in her arms. "Where are you taking me?" she finally asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "Somewhere safe," Killian said. "For tonight at least. Tomorrow we can discuss what happens next." She wanted to argue, wanted to demand more information, but exhaustion had settled so deeply into her bones that she found herself simply following without further protest, too drained to summon the energy for suspicion just yet. They walked in silence through the dark forest paths that connected the ruined mill to the nearest settlement, Killian's guards forming a loose perimeter around them, watchful and alert in a way that made Elena feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely protected rather than merely tolerated. The house they eventually reached was modest by the standards she assumed a king might keep, a simple stone cottage on the edge of a quiet village, clearly used as a waypoint rather than a permanent residence. Killian opened the door himself and gestured for her to enter, remaining outside on the threshold, as though giving her space to feel less trapped. "There's food inside, and a bed for you and your son," he said. "My men will stand watch outside through the night. No one will bother you here." Elena hesitated in the doorway, studying his face in the dim light spilling from a single lamp inside the cottage. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You don't know me. You don't know my son. Powerful men don't destroy entire markets and rescue strangers without wanting something in return." Something flickered across Killian's expression, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. "You're right to be cautious," he said. "I won't pretend my reasons tonight were entirely about you. I've had suspicions about that market for months, evidence that members of my own council were involved in running it. Tonight gave me the proof I needed to act." He paused, his amber eyes holding hers steadily. "But that doesn't mean I don't care what happens to you and your son now that you're free of it. Rest tonight. We'll talk more tomorrow, when you've had time to recover." He left her at the door then, retreating to join his men outside, and Elena stepped inside the cottage, closing the door behind her, with hands that still shook slightly. She fed Wolf, changed him, and laid him gently in a small crib someone had apparently prepared in advance, before finally allowing herself to collapse onto the narrow bed beside it, sleep claiming her almost instantly despite every unanswered question still swirling through her exhausted mind. She woke to sunlight streaming through a narrow window and the sound of Wolf fussing softly in his crib. For a moment, disoriented, she forgot where she was, her heart lurching with panic before the memories of the previous night flooded back and settled into something resembling relief. She rose, tended to her son, and found a simple meal of bread and fruit waiting on a small table near the hearth, along with a note in careful handwriting, informing her that Killian would return by midday to discuss her situation further. True to his word, he arrived just as the sun reached its highest point, knocking politely before entering when she called out permission. He looked different in daylight, less like the shadowy figure who had commanded a room into silence, and more like an ordinary man, though the quiet authority in his bearing remained unmistakable. He carried himself the way she imagined a soldier might, alert and composed, but there was warmth in his eyes when he looked at Wolf that softened the sternness of his features considerably. "How are you feeling?" he asked, taking a seat across from her at the small table when she gestured for him to sit. "Confused," Elena admitted honestly. "Grateful, but confused. I keep waiting for the price of last night's rescue to reveal itself." Killian's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "I understand your caution, but I have no hidden price to demand from you, Elena." He said her name carefully, as though testing whether he had learned it correctly from his men, who must have gathered it from the market's records. "What I do need is your help with something else entirely, something related to why I was at that market in the first place." She studied him warily. "What kind of help?" "I need someone willing to testify to what happened there," he said. "Not just about your own experience, though that alone would carry weight, but about the pattern of it, how debts were manufactured, how enforcers like Garrick were used to force compliance. My council has members who profited from that market for years, and I need evidence strong enough to remove them permanently. A woman who survived it, who can speak clearly and credibly about what she witnessed, would be invaluable." Elena's stomach twisted at the thought of standing before powerful men again, reliving the worst night of her life in front of an audience that might not believe her, or worse, might punish her for speaking out. "And if I refuse?" "Then you refuse," Killian said simply. "I won't force you into anything, Elena. You've had enough forced upon you already. But I want you to know that if you agree, you and your son will remain under my protection for as long as necessary, safe from Ashwood Pack, and safe from anyone who might wish to silence you for speaking the truth." She considered his words carefully, weighing the fear of confronting her past against the possibility of ensuring that no other mother would ever stand on that platform again, waiting for strangers to bid on her child. Slowly, she looked down at Wolf, sleeping peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the weight of the decision being made on his behalf. "I'll do it," she said finally. "But I want protection guaranteed, not just promised. My son's safety comes before anything else." "You have my word," Killian said, and something in the steady certainty of his voice made her believe him, despite every instinct that told her powerful men rarely kept promises made to Omegas without a pack behind them. Over the following days, Elena settled into an uneasy rhythm within the walls of Killian's stronghold, a sprawling estate built into the side of a wooded hill overlooking a wide valley. The estate housed not only Killian's household but also a substantial portion of his council and guard, and Elena quickly learned to navigate its unfamiliar hallways, with Wolf balanced on her hip, always aware of curious glances from servants and council members alike, unused to seeing an unclaimed Omega and her child walking freely through spaces normally reserved for pack royalty. Killian's advisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Celine who managed much of the estate's daily affairs, took an immediate interest in Elena's well-being, ensuring she had proper clothing, adequate food, and a private room away from prying eyes. Celine was not warm exactly, but she was efficient and fair, and Elena found herself grateful for the woman's quiet competence during a time when so much of her life felt uncertain. "He's not what people say he is, you know," Celine told her one afternoon, as they sat together in a small garden while Wolf napped nearby. "The Alpha King. People assume all alphas at his level are the same, cold and calculating, using power for their own gain. But Killian took this territory at great cost, and he spent every year since trying to root out corruption that existed long before he inherited the throne. That market you were rescued from, it's been operating in some form for over a decade. He's been hunting for proof of who was truly responsible for years." Elena absorbed this information quietly, turning it over in her mind alongside her own observations of the Alpha King during their brief interactions. He was reserved, careful with his words, but never unkind, and he made a point of checking on her and Wolf's well-being personally, at least once each day, despite what she assumed must be an overwhelming array of other responsibilities demanding his attention. One evening, nearly a week after the market's collapse, Elena found herself in the estate's main hall, long after most residents had retired for the night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She found Killian there as well, seated near a low burning fire, a stack of documents spread across the table before him, his expression tired in a way she had not seen before. "Trouble sleeping?" he asked, glancing up as she entered. "Too many thoughts," she admitted, settling into a chair, a respectful distance from his own. What are you working on? Evidence, he said, gesturing at the documents. Records recovered from the market, cross-referenced against my council members' known dealings. It's slow work, but necessary. He rubbed a hand across his tired eyes. I keep thinking about how many other markets like that one might still exist, hidden in territories I don't control, run by people who learned from watching this one operate successfully for so long. Is that why you need my testimony? Elena asked. Not just to punish the men responsible for this market, but to prevent others from starting new ones? Killian met her eyes, something like respect flickering across his tired features. Exactly that. If the punishment for running such an operation is severe and public enough, it becomes a warning to anyone else considering the same path. Elena nodded slowly, understanding settling over her with new weight. This was not simply about her own rescue, or even about justice for the women she had stood beside on that terrible platform. This was about something larger, a pattern of exploitation that stretched across territories and years, and she found herself, for the first time since Garrick had first appeared at her door, feeling something other than fear when she thought about the road ahead. She felt purpose. The council chamber fell silent the moment Elena stepped through its heavy oak doors, every eye turning toward her with a mixture of curiosity and open suspicion. She had expected the stares, had braced herself for them during the long walk from her quarters, but the weight of so much attention still made her pulse quicken uncomfortably as she crossed the polished stone floor toward the raised platform where Killian and 11 council members sat waiting. This was the day her testimony would formally begin, the day everything she had witnessed at that terrible market would be laid bare before the very body responsible for governing the territory in which it had operated. Killian had warned her that some council members might resist her account, might even attempt to discredit her, and she reminded herself of his warning now, as she took her place at the center of the chamber, Wolf left safely in Celine's care back in her quarters. State your name for the record, instructed an older man, seated near the end of the council table, his tone clipped and businesslike. Elena, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. Formerly of the Ashwood Pack. And you claim to have witnessed illegal trafficking activities at the location commonly referred to as the grain mill market, the man continued, consulting a document in front of him. I don't claim it, Elena said, allowing a thread of steel to enter her voice despite her nerves. I lived it. I was forced there myself, threatened with the loss of my son over a debt I never agreed to owe. A ripple of murmurs passed through the assembled council members, and Elena caught sight of one man near the far end of the table shifting uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the exit as though calculating the distance to freedom. Killian, seated at the head of the table, noticed the movement as well, his expression hardening slightly, though he said nothing yet, clearly wanting to let Elena's testimony unfold without interruption. Describe, in your own words, the events leading to your presence at the market, the older man instructed. Elena took a steadying breath and began to recount the events of that terrible week, starting with Garrick's arrival at her cabin, and ending with the moment Killian had stepped forward to dismantle the entire operation. She spoke clearly, deliberately, forcing herself to include every detail she could remember, no matter how painful, understanding that the strength of her testimony depended on its thoroughness. Several council members took notes as she spoke. Others simply watched her, with expressions ranging from sympathy to something colder, more calculating. When she finished, the chamber remained quiet for a long moment before a woman near the center of the table spoke up, her tone carrying an edge of skepticism that made Elena's shoulders tense. How can we be certain this account is accurate, and not simply a story crafted to gain favor with the Alpha King who so conveniently rescued you? Elena felt anger flare in her chest, but she kept her voice level when she responded. I have no reason to lie about the worst night of my life. I lost nothing by staying silent about what happened to me, and I gain nothing now except the possibility that speaking the truth might prevent another mother from standing where I stood. If you doubt my word, I would encourage you to speak with the other women who were in that line beside me. Their accounts will match mine. The woman's expression flickered, some of her skepticism giving way to grudging consideration, though she said nothing further. It was then that the man who had shifted uncomfortably earlier finally spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. This testimony is troubling, certainly, but surely a single Omega's word cannot be sufficient grounds to launch a full investigation into council members who have served this territory faithfully for years. Killian's eyes turned toward him slowly, and something in that gaze made the man's confidence visibly falter. "Councilman Dorian," Killian said, his voice deceptively calm. "I don't recall mentioning that her testimony alone would be the basis for any investigation. I have recovered ledgers from the market itself, financial records that trace certain transactions back to specific individuals within this very chamber. Elena's account simply confirms what those records already suggest." Dorian's face paled visibly, and Elena watched with quiet satisfaction as the man's earlier bravado crumbled beneath the weight of Killian's steady gaze. She had suspected, based on Celine's earlier comments, that at least some council members were implicated in the market's operation, but seeing the accusation land so precisely, watching a guilty man's composure shatter in real time, gave her a small measure of vindication she had not expected to feel. "These records are circumstantial at best," Dorian protested, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Perhaps," Killian said, "which is precisely why Elena's testimony, along with the accounts of several other women who were present that night, matters so significantly. Circumstantial evidence becomes considerably less circumstantial when corroborated by multiple independent witnesses describing the same pattern of behavior." He turned his attention back to the full council. "I intend to conduct a thorough investigation into every member's involvement, direct or indirect, with the operation of that market. Anyone found complicit will be removed from this council and face appropriate consequences for their actions." The chamber erupted into a flurry of hushed conversation, council members turning to whisper urgently among themselves, while Dorian sat frozen, his earlier protests apparently having failed to derail the momentum building against him. Elena remained standing at the center of the room, watching the chaos unfold, feeling a strange mixture of relief and lingering unease. She had done what Killian asked of her, had spoken the truth clearly and without hesitation, but she understood that exposing corruption at this level would not happen without consequences, and she wondered how many of the men now whispering nervously among themselves might view her as a threat worth eliminating. After the session concluded, Killian found her in a quiet corridor outside the chamber, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. "You did well," he said, his voice gentler than the commanding tone he had used inside the chamber. "Better than well. You handled yourself with more composure than most seasoned advisors manage during their first council appearance." "It didn't feel composed," Elena admitted. "It felt like reliving every terrible moment of that night, in front of an audience that half suspected I was lying." "Some of them did suspect that," Killian acknowledged. "Dorian certainly did, though I suspect his skepticism had less to do with doubting your honesty, and more to do with fearing what your honesty might expose about his own involvement." "You think he was part of it," Elena said. "It was not really a question." "I know he was," Killian replied. "The ledgers I mentioned trace several transactions directly to accounts under his control. Your testimony simply gave me the opportunity to confront him publicly, to begin building a case that the full council could not easily dismiss." Elena studied his face carefully, noting the careful control in his expression, the way he seemed to weigh every word before speaking it aloud. "Were you always planning to use me this way, as a public witness to force his hand?" Something in her tone must have carried an edge of accusation, because Killian's expression shifted, a flicker of something like hurt crossing his features before he schooled it back into composure. "I asked for your help, Elena. I didn't force you into that chamber today. If you feel I've used you dishonestly, I want you to tell me directly, because that was never my intention." Elena considered his words, considered the genuine concern in his eyes, and felt some of her earlier anger soften into something more complicated. "I don't think you used me dishonestly," she admitted finally. "I think you saw an opportunity to expose corruption, and I happened to be someone who could help you seize it. I'm not angry about that. I just needed to understand it clearly, for my own peace of mind." "That's fair," Killian said quietly. "And for what it's worth, I am grateful for what you did today. Beyond simply what it accomplishes for my investigation, it took considerable courage to stand in that chamber and speak as clearly as you did." They walked together back toward the estate's residential wing in comfortable silence, and Elena found herself, not for the first time, studying the Alpha King, with a curiosity that went beyond mere gratitude for her rescue. There was a weariness in him that she recognized, the particular exhaustion of someone who carried responsibility for far more than themselves, who had spent years fighting battles that few others even noticed were being fought. She wondered, as they reached the door to her quarters and he bid her a quiet good night, whether anyone within these walls ever truly saw the man beneath the crown, or whether everyone, herself included, still saw only the powerful Alpha King, rather than the person carrying that power's weight. Dorian did not wait long before making his next move. 3 nights after the council session where Killian had named him publicly as a suspect, Elena woke to the sound of raised voices somewhere deep within the estate, distant, but sharp enough to pull her from sleep with her heart already pounding. She rose quickly, checked on Wolf, who remained blessedly asleep in his crib, and crept toward the door of her quarters, straining to make out the words carried faintly down the corridor. She recognized Celine's voice first, tight with controlled anger, followed by the low, urgent tones of one of Killian's senior guards. Unable to resist the pull of curiosity mixed with genuine concern, Elena wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the hallway, following the voices toward the estate's eastern wing, where Killian kept his private study. She found Celine standing outside the study door, arms crossed, her expression grim, as she spoke quietly with 2 guards positioned on either side of the entrance. When she noticed Elena approaching, her expression softened slightly, though the tension in her shoulders remained. "What's happening?" Elena asked. "Dorian fled the estate sometime after midnight," Celine said, "along with 2 other council members we suspect were involved in the market's operation. They've likely gone to gather allies, or perhaps to destroy evidence before Killian's investigation can reach it." Elena's stomach tightened with unease. "Is he in danger? Killian, I mean." Celine's eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise at the question, though she answered evenly. "Killian can handle himself in most circumstances, but a cornered man with resources and something significant to lose can be unpredictable. He's meeting with his senior guard now to determine how best to respond." Elena remained in the corridor for nearly an hour, unable to return to sleep despite Celine's gentle suggestion that she do so, until finally the study door opened and Killian emerged, his expression tired but resolute. He seemed surprised to find her still waiting there, though something in his expression softened at the sight of her. "You should be resting," he said. "I couldn't," Elena admitted. "Not after hearing what happened. Are you in danger?" Killian's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile, though weariness dulled it considerably. "Concerned for my well-being, are you?" "Someone has to be, apparently, given how casually you seem to treat threats against your own life," Elena replied, a hint of dry humor slipping into her voice, despite the tension of the moment. That earned her a genuine, if brief, laugh from Killian, low and warm, and Elena found herself unexpectedly pleased to have drawn it from him during such a fraught evening. "Dorian and his allies have fled, but they haven't gone far. My trackers already have their scent. I expect we'll have them detained within a day, 2 at most. And if they resist detainment? Then they'll face the same consequences as anyone who resists lawful authority within my territory," Killian said, his tone hardening slightly. "I won't allow men who profited from trafficking children to escape justice simply because they've decided to run, rather than face the consequences of their actions." Elena studied him for a long moment, noting the exhaustion etched into his features, the weight of responsibility that seemed to settle more heavily on his shoulders with each passing day of this investigation. "You haven't slept properly in days," she observed quietly. "There hasn't been time," Killian admitted, rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. "Every hour I don't spend pursuing this investigation is an hour Dorian and his allies might use to cover their tracks more thoroughly." "Exhaustion makes people careless," Elena said. "You won't serve justice well if you collapse from lack of rest before you can see this through." Something in her tone must have carried more genuine concern than she intended, because Killian's expression shifted, softening into something almost tender, as he studied her face in the dim hallway light. "You worry about me," he said, not quite a question. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain how to answer honestly, without revealing more than she felt ready to acknowledge, even to herself. "I worry about what happens to Wolf and me if the man protecting us runs himself into the ground before finishing what he started," she said, which was true, though perhaps not the entire truth. Killian's eyes held hers for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them in the quiet hallway. "I'll rest," he said finally. Once Dorian is detained, I promise you I'll rest. He kept his word, more or less. 2 days later, word arrived that Dorian and his fellow conspirators had been located hiding in a border settlement, attempting to negotiate protection from a neighboring pack in exchange for information about Killian's territory. The neighboring Alpha, unwilling to risk conflict with someone as powerful as Killian Ashford over 3 disgraced councilmen, had refused their request and instead sent word directly to Killian's trackers, effectively sealing their fate. The men were brought back to the estate under heavy guard, and Elena watched from a distance as they were led through the main courtyard toward the estate's holding cells, their earlier arrogance replaced entirely by the hollow, defeated expressions of men who understood their schemes had finally caught up with them. Dorian's eyes found hers briefly as he passed, filled with a bitterness that made her skin crawl, though she held his gaze steadily, refusing to look away or show any hint of the unease his expression stirred in her. That evening, Killian found her in the garden, where she often sat with Wolf during quiet hours, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and violet. He looked considerably better than he had during their late-night conversation days earlier. Some color returned to his face, the shadows beneath his eyes less pronounced. "You look rested," Elena observed, offering him a small smile as he settled onto the bench beside her. "I kept my promise," Killian said. "Dorian and the others are secured. Their trial will begin within the week. And after that? After that, hopefully, the worst of this particular crisis will be behind us." He paused, watching Wolf reach curiously toward a nearby flowering bush, his small fingers grasping at petals just out of reach. "Though I suspect you'll want to know what happens to you and your son once the trial concludes." Elena's chest tightened slightly at the question, uncertain how to answer honestly. In the weeks since the market's collapse, she had grown accustomed to the rhythm of life within Killian's estate, had grown, if she were honest with herself, accustomed to Killian's quiet presence checking on her well-being each day, to the particular warmth that settled in her chest whenever he looked at Wolf with genuine affection rather than mere obligation. The thought of leaving, of returning to the isolated, precarious existence she had known before, filled her with a dread she had not expected to feel. "I hadn't thought that far ahead," she admitted honestly. "I suppose I assumed I would need to find somewhere to go, eventually." "You don't have to assume that," Killian said quietly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "You and Wolf are welcome to remain here for as long as you wish, Elena. Not merely as witnesses under protection, but as members of this household, should that be something you want." The offer hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither of them seemed quite ready to name directly. Elena studied Killian's face, searching for any sign of hidden expectation behind his words, and found only quiet sincerity, the same steady honesty she had come to associate with him over these past weeks. "That's a generous offer," she said carefully, "but I would need to understand what it means, practically speaking. I won't accept charity, built on unspoken conditions." "There are no unspoken conditions," Killian said. "I'm not asking anything of you, in exchange for safety, Elena. I'm simply telling you that I would like you to stay, if staying is something you want for yourself and for your son." Elena looked down at Wolf, who had abandoned his pursuit of the flowering bush, and was now attempting to pull himself upright, using her knee for support, his small face scrunched with determined effort. She thought about the cramped, leaking cabin she had once called home, about the isolation and scorn she had endured there, about the terror of that night at the market that had nearly cost her everything that mattered. And she thought, too, about the quiet comfort she had found within these unfamiliar walls, about the particular warmth in Killian's eyes whenever he watched her son, about the strange, unexpected sense of safety that had settled over her more deeply with each passing day. "I think," she said slowly, "that staying might be exactly what I want, for both of us." Killian's answering smile was small but genuine, warming his tired features in a way that made Elena's own heart flutter unexpectedly. Neither of them spoke further about what this decision might eventually mean for the relationship quietly building between them, but as they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sunset fade into evening, while Wolf babbled happily between them, Elena allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to imagine a future that did not begin and end with mere survival. The trial of Dorian and his fellow conspirators drew crowds from across Killian's territory, curious residents and representatives from neighboring packs, gathering in the estate's largest hall to witness the proceedings firsthand. Elena stood among the witnesses called to testify once more, though this time she felt considerably steadier than she had during her first appearance before the council, the weeks of growing confidence within Killian's household having settled her nerves in ways she had not expected. The evidence against Dorian proved damning beyond dispute. Financial records recovered from the market's hidden ledgers traced years of transactions directly to accounts under his control, alongside testimony from 4 other women who had survived the market's operation, each account corroborating the pattern Elena herself had described. One by one, they stood before the assembled crowd and spoke of threats, of manufactured debts, of children nearly lost to strangers' greed, their combined voices forming a chorus of truth that no amount of denial could overcome. Dorian attempted, briefly, to shift blame onto lower-ranking associates, claiming ignorance of the market's true nature, despite evidence proving otherwise. His protests grew increasingly desperate as witness after witness dismantled his carefully constructed defense, until finally, faced with overwhelming evidence and the unwavering resolve in Killian's expression as he presided over the proceedings, Dorian's composure shattered entirely. "I did what was necessary to maintain my position," he finally admitted, his voice cracking with something between anger and despair. "This territory has always run on debts and favors, on knowing which weaknesses to exploit. I simply understood the game better than most." A ripple of disgust passed through the assembled crowd at his casual admission, and Elena felt her stomach turn at the man's utter lack of remorse, even in the face of undeniable guilt. Killian's expression remained carefully controlled, though Elena, having grown familiar with his subtle expressions over these past weeks, recognized the barely restrained fury simmering beneath his composed exterior. "You call the suffering of desperate mothers and their children a game," Killian said, his voice low and dangerous in a way Elena had not heard before. "You call the theft of infants from their parents nothing more than clever strategy. I want you to understand, clearly, that this territory will no longer tolerate such games, and that your punishment will reflect the severity of the harm you have caused." The sentence, when it came, stripped Dorian and his fellow conspirators of all rank, wealth, and standing within the territory, banishing them permanently to lands far beyond Killian's borders, with clear warning that any attempt to return would be met with lethal consequence. It was not the harshest punishment available under the old laws, but it was severe enough to send a clear message throughout the region that such exploitation would no longer be tolerated within Killian Ashford's domain. As the crowd began to disperse following the sentencing, Elena found herself approached by several of the other survivors who had testified alongside her, women she had grown to know during the weeks of preparation for trial. The silver-haired woman from the market, whose name she had since learned was Ivy, embraced her tightly, tears of relief streaming down her weathered face. "We did it," Ivy whispered. "We actually did it. My daughter is safe now, truly safe, not just safe until the next debt collector arrives at my door." Elena returned the embrace warmly, understanding the depth of relief in Ivy's words more completely than most could have. "We did," she agreed. "Together." In the days following the trial's conclusion, life within Killian's estate settled into something that felt, for the first time since Elena's arrival, genuinely peaceful rather than merely temporary. She found herself spending increasing amounts of time in Killian's company, not merely during formal discussions about her testimony or the ongoing investigation into the market's remaining operations, but during quiet, unstructured moments that gradually began to feel like something more significant than simple friendship. He would often join her in the garden during evening hours, ostensibly to discuss estate matters, but frequently drifting into conversations about nothing consequential at all, about Wolf's latest attempts at crawling, about Elena's memories of her own childhood before circumstances had grown difficult, about Killian's own experiences inheriting a territory burdened with corruption he had spent years working to dismantle. "My father built much of this territory's wealth on exactly the kind of exploitation we just prosecuted," Killian admitted one evening, his voice quiet and reflective as they sat together, watching the last light fade from the sky. "I didn't fully understand the extent of it until after his death, when I began reviewing records he had kept hidden, even from his own counsel. It took years to even begin unraveling everything he had built." "That must have been difficult," Elena said. "Discovering your own father was responsible for such harm." "It was," Killian agreed. "I spent a long time wondering whether I was truly different from him, or whether I simply hadn't yet developed the same capacity for exploitation that he possessed so easily. He glanced at her, something vulnerable flickering across his usually composed features. Meeting you. Watching how fiercely you fought to protect your son, despite everything stacked against you. It reminded me why I've spent so many years trying to prove myself different from what my father built. Elena felt her chest tighten with something warm and unfamiliar at his words, an emotion she was hesitant to name too quickly, given how much upheaval her life had already experienced in recent months. You are different from him, she said softly. I've seen enough of how you handle power to know that much for certain. Killian's answering smile carried a warmth that made her pulse quicken slightly, and for a moment, sitting together in the quiet garden with Wolf sleeping peacefully nearby, Elena allowed herself to imagine what a future built alongside this careful, honorable man might actually look like. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed within the estate. Celine, ever perceptive, began finding subtle excuses to leave Elena and Killian alone during evening hours, while some of the estate's longtime staff exchanged knowing glances whenever the two of them appeared together. Though no one spoke openly about what everyone seemed to be quietly observing, Elena found herself uncertain how to navigate this shifting dynamic, torn between the cautious walls she had built after years of scorn from her old pack, and the growing warmth she felt whenever Killian's attention turned toward her and her son. It was during one such quiet evening, several weeks after the trial's conclusion, that Killian finally addressed the unspoken tension building between them directly. They sat together in the garden, as had become their habit, Wolf playing contentedly nearby with a soft toy Celine had given him, when Killian turned to face her with an expression more serious than his usual relaxed demeanor during these evening conversations. Elena, he began, his voice careful, deliberate. I've come to care for you a great deal over these past weeks, more than I initially anticipated when I first offered you protection within these walls. I understand if circumstances make it difficult for you to trust such feelings, given everything you've endured, but I wanted you to know how I feel, rather than leaving you to wonder. Elena's heart pounded loudly in her chest as she absorbed his words, torn between the instinctive caution years of hardship had instilled in her, and the genuine warmth that had been steadily growing in her own heart throughout their time together. I care for you too, she admitted finally, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating to speak aloud. More than I expected to, given how our paths crossed. Then perhaps, Killian said, reaching to gently take her hand in his own, we might consider exploring what this could become, together, without rushing toward anything neither of us feels ready for. Elena's fingers curled around his, drawing strength from the warmth of his touch, and for the first time since Garrick had first darkened her doorway with threats and cruelty, she allowed herself to believe fully in the possibility of a future built on safety, respect, and genuine partnership, rather than mere survival. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever threats might yet emerge from the remnants of the market's operations, or from those who resented the changes Killian had brought to this territory, she found herself ready to face them, not alone as she had always been before, but alongside someone who had proven, time and again, that his strength served protection rather than exploitation. Peace, Elena had learned, rarely lasted long when power changed hands as significantly as it had within Killian's territory, following Dorian's banishment. Word reached the estate barely a month after the trial's conclusion that remnants of the market's original network, associates of Dorian, who had escaped direct prosecution due to insufficient evidence, were quietly attempting to rebuild their operations in a neighboring territory just beyond Killian's direct jurisdiction. Killian received the news during a council meeting Elena now regularly attended, her insight into the market's operations having proven valuable enough that the council had extended her a standing invitation to participate in relevant discussions. The messenger, a young scout named Callum, delivered his report with visible unease, clearly aware of how unwelcome this particular news would be. They've established a smaller operation near the border settlement of Thornfield, Callum reported. Fewer resources than before, but the same basic structure. Manufactured debts, coerced sales, though they're being considerably more careful this time about hiding their tracks. Killian's jaw tightened as he absorbed this information, and Elena recognized the familiar tension settling into his shoulders, the particular weariness of a man who had believed a battle finished, only to discover it had merely shifted location. How certain are we of this information? Certain enough, Callum said, I have a contact within Thornfield who has seen the operation firsthand. She's willing to provide testimony, if given proper protection. Then we'll need to move quickly, Killian said, before they have time to fully establish themselves. He glanced toward Elena, something apologetic in his expression. This will likely require your involvement again, if you're willing. Your testimony helped bring down the original network. It may prove equally valuable in dismantling whatever these remnants are attempting to rebuild. Elena nodded without hesitation, the fierce protectiveness she felt for Wolf extending naturally toward every mother who might otherwise find herself standing on a similar platform, facing the same terrible choice she had once faced. Whatever you need from me, I'll provide it. The following weeks passed in a flurry of careful planning, Killian's trackers gathering additional evidence about the Thornfield operation, while Elena worked alongside Celine to prepare testimony and coordinate with the handful of other survivors willing to speak publicly about their experiences once again. The process proved considerably less traumatic this second time, the earlier trial having established both precedent and confidence in confronting such corruption directly, though the underlying anger at discovering the exploitation had simply relocated rather than ended, entirely burned steadily in Elena's chest throughout the preparations. It was during this period of preparation that the first direct threat against Elena and Wolf finally materialized, delivered in the form of an anonymous note left at the estate's outer gate, discovered by a guard during his morning rounds. The note contained no signature, only a brief, chilling warning that Elena's continued cooperation with Killian's investigation would result in consequences she would regret, consequences that specifically mentioned her son by name. Killian's reaction upon reading the note was immediate and severe, his usual careful composure cracking momentarily to reveal something closer to barely controlled fury. "Whoever sent this will answer for threatening a child," he said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way that made even the estate's hardened guards straighten with attention. "Double the patrols around Elena's quarters immediately. No one enters or leaves without proper verification." Elena, for her part, felt the familiar cold grip of fear settling into her stomach, though this time it was tempered by a fierce, protective anger that had not been available to her during her earlier isolation. "They're trying to frighten me into silence," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the tremor she felt beneath it. "I won't let them succeed." "I don't doubt your courage," Killian said, his expression softening as he took her hands in his own. "But I need you to understand that courage alone cannot guarantee safety against people willing to threaten a child to protect their own interests. We'll increase precautions significantly for both you and Wolf until this threat has been properly addressed." True to his word, Killian implemented security measures throughout the estate that made Elena's earlier arrival, with its comparatively relaxed atmosphere, feel like a distant memory. Guards patrolled every corridor near her quarters around the clock, and Wolf was never left unattended, even for the briefest moment, with either Elena, Celine, or a trusted guard maintaining constant watch over him at all times. Despite these precautions, the anonymous threats continued sporadically over the following weeks, each one carefully worded to avoid providing any concrete evidence that might identify their source, yet unmistakable in their intent to intimidate Elena into abandoning her cooperation with the investigation. She found herself, more than once, waking from nightmares where Wolf was torn from her arms once again, her heart pounding with residual terror, long after she had reassured herself that he remained safely asleep in his crib nearby. Killian noticed her growing exhaustion during one particularly difficult evening, finding her in the garden long after most of the estate had retired for the night. Wolf held tightly against her chest, despite his peaceful sleep. "Another nightmare?" he asked gently, settling beside her on the familiar bench. "The same one," Elena admitted. "I keep reliving that night at the market, except this time, no one arrives to stop it. These threats have made the memory feel closer than it has in weeks." Killian's expression tightened with something like guilt. "I'm sorry that my investigation has brought this fear back into your life so vividly. If continuing to testify feels like too great a risk, Elena, I would understand completely if you chose to step back from this particular fight." Elena shook her head firmly. "No. If I stop now, if I let fear silence me, then everything we accomplished with Dorian's trial means considerably less. Other mothers are still vulnerable to whatever these remnants are building in Thornfield. I won't abandon them simply because someone wants to frighten me into silence. Then know that whatever threats emerge, I will do everything within my power to ensure neither you nor Wolf ever face genuine danger from them." Killian said, his voice carrying a fierce certainty that settled some of the anxious knot in Elena's chest. You are not facing this alone, Elena, not this time. His words, and the steady warmth of his presence beside her, provided a comfort that Elena had not realized she desperately needed, until she felt it settling over her exhausted spirit. She leaned into his shoulder, allowing herself the rare luxury of feeling protected, rather than merely surviving, and for a while, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge overhead, while Wolf continued his peaceful sleep between them. The investigation into the Thornfield operation proceeded steadily over the following month, Killian's trackers gathering sufficient evidence to justify direct intervention, despite the operation technically falling outside his immediate jurisdiction. Diplomatic negotiations with the neighboring Alpha, who proved considerably more cooperative than the trafficking network operating within his territory, eventually secured permission for Killian's forces to conduct a joint operation, dismantling the Thornfield network entirely. The raid itself, when it finally occurred, proceeded with considerably less drama than the original market's collapse, Killian's forces moving swiftly and decisively to detain the network's organizers before they could scatter or destroy incriminating evidence. Elena received word of the operation's success while sitting in the garden with Wolf, and felt a wave of relief wash over her so profound that tears sprang unbidden to her eyes. Killian returned to the estate later that evening, dust still clinging to his traveling clothes, his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a difficult task successfully completed. He found Elena waiting near the estate's main entrance, and the moment their eyes met, she crossed the distance between them without hesitation, wrapping her arms around him in an embrace that spoke more clearly than words could manage of her relief and gratitude. It's finished, Killian murmured against her hair, holding her close. Thornfield's network has been dismantled entirely, its organizers detained and awaiting trial. The threats against you and Wolf should end now that their source has been eliminated. Elena pulled back slightly to look up at him, searching his tired but satisfied expression. Thank you, she said softly, not just for tonight, but for everything you've done since that first night at the market. I don't know how to properly express how much your protection has meant to both Wolf and me. Killian's hand rose to gently cup her cheek, his amber eyes holding hers, with an intensity that made her breath catch. You don't need to thank me for choosing to protect what matters most to me, he said quietly. And you and Wolf have come to matter more to me than I ever anticipated when I first stepped forward at that auction. The kiss that followed felt inevitable in a way that surprised neither of them. Months of carefully building trust and quiet affection, finally finding their natural expression in the warm evening air. When they finally parted, Elena rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, allowing herself fully, for the first time, to believe in the possibility of genuine happiness after everything she had endured. Months passed, and the quiet contentment Elena had discovered within Killian's estate deepened into something she had once believed impossible for someone in her circumstances to ever experience. Wolf grew stronger and more curious with each passing week, taking his first unsteady steps across the garden grass one bright afternoon, while Elena and Killian watched together, both of them laughing with delight at his wobbling, determined progress toward a favorite toy, left just out of easy reach. Elena's relationship with Killian had settled into something comfortable, yet still exciting, the careful courtship of their early months together, gradually deepening into an understanding that felt increasingly permanent, though neither of them had yet spoken formally about what a future together might officially entail. Celine had taken to referring to Elena, half teasingly, as though her position within the household were already settled, a habit that made Elena's cheeks warm each time she heard it, though she found she did not particularly mind the implication. It was during this peaceful stretch of time that Elena first noticed the stranger watching her from the edge of the market square during a rare trip into the nearby village, a task she had undertaken alongside Celine to purchase supplies for Wolf's rapidly growing wardrobe. The man's presence registered only as a fleeting unease at first, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck that made her glance instinctively toward a nearby alley, catching sight of dark, watchful eyes, before the figure melted back into the crowd. "Did you see that?" she asked Celine quietly, her earlier ease evaporating into wary alertness. "See what?" Celine asked, following Elena's gaze toward the now empty alley. "Someone was watching us," Elena said, though doubt crept into her voice, even as she spoke the words. I might have imagined it. Celine's expression grew serious, despite Elena's hesitation. Given everything you've survived, I'd rather take your instincts seriously than dismiss them too quickly. We should return to the estate and mention this to Killian. Killian's reaction upon hearing Elena's account proved considerably more concerned than she had anticipated, his relaxed evening demeanor sharpening immediately into the focused alertness she associated with genuine threat assessment. Describe him as best you can, he instructed, and Elena did so, providing what details she could recall of the stranger's build, his dark clothing, the particular intensity of his watchful gaze. It could be nothing, Killian acknowledged. Simple curiosity from a villager unused to seeing you and Celine together in the market. But given the history we're dealing with, I'd rather investigate thoroughly than dismiss the possibility of continued threat. His trackers spent the following days quietly investigating, questioning villagers, and reviewing recent arrivals to the settlement, though their initial inquiries yielded frustratingly little concrete information. Elena tried to settle back into her normal routine despite the lingering unease, reminding herself that Thornfield's network had been thoroughly dismantled, that Dorian remained banished, far beyond the territory's borders, that perhaps she had simply imagined danger where none genuinely existed. Her reassurances proved tragically premature. Late one evening, nearly 2 weeks after the incident in the village, Elena woke abruptly to the sound of Wolf's crib creaking softly, a sound she recognized immediately as wrong, since her son had long since outgrown the fitful, restless sleep that once produced such noises. She sat up sharply, her heart already pounding with instinctive alarm, and saw a shadowed figure standing beside the crib, reaching toward her sleeping son. "Get away from him," she screamed, lunging from her bed before conscious thought could catch up with pure maternal instinct. The figure startled at her sudden movement, turning toward her with dark, hooded features she couldn't clearly make out in the dim moonlight filtering through her window, and for one terrifying moment, Elena feared she would not reach Wolf in time. Her scream had already carried through the quiet estate, however, and within seconds, the door to her quarters burst open, revealing 2 of Killian's guards, weapons drawn, alerted by the sound of her terror. The intruder, realizing his opportunity had evaporated, abandoned his attempt to reach Wolf, and instead lunged toward the window, attempting escape, only to find himself intercepted by the guards before he could gain any meaningful distance. Chaos erupted through the estate as more guards arrived, drawn by the commotion, and Elena scooped Wolf from his crib the moment the intruder had been subdued, clutching him against her chest with trembling hands, checking desperately for any sign of harm, despite his continued, blessedly undisturbed sleep. The entire terrifying episode had unfolded in mere moments, yet it left Elena shaking violently, adrenaline and residual terror coursing through her veins, long after the immediate danger had passed. Killian arrived moments later, having been roused from his own quarters by the commotion, his expression transforming from alarm to fierce, barely controlled fury the moment he took in the scene before him, the subdued intruder held firmly by 2 guards, Elena trembling but unharmed, with Wolf safely in her arms. "Is he hurt?" Killian demanded, his voice tight with barely restrained emotion as he crossed the room to Elena's side. "He's fine," Elena managed, though her voice shook considerably. "He never woke. I stopped him before he could reach Wolf." Killian's arms wrapped around both of them, holding them close with a fierce protectiveness that spoke more clearly than words of the depth of his fear during those chaotic moments. "I should never have relaxed our precautions," he said, his voice rough with self-recrimination. "I let myself believe the threat had truly ended."
"You couldn't have known," Elena said, though her own voice carried a tremor she couldn't entirely suppress. "None of us could have known."
The intruder, once questioned, revealed himself to be a hired agent, paid handsomely by a source he claimed not to fully know, though the payment method eventually traced back, after careful investigation, to remnants of Dorian's old network, operating from beyond the territory's borders, apparently seeking retribution for the destruction of both the original market and its Thornfield successor. The revelation confirmed what Killian and Elena had both feared, that the danger surrounding them had not truly ended with the previous operation's dismantling, but had simply gone quiet, waiting for an opportunity to strike when vigilance inevitably relaxed. "This ends now," Killian said, his voice carrying a cold, absolute certainty that Elena had rarely heard from him before. even during the tensest moments of the earlier investigations. I will not allow remnants of a destroyed network to continue threatening my household, and I will not allow the woman I love and her son to live under constant fear of retaliation. Elena's breath caught at his words, at the casual, unhesitating way he had spoken of love, amid the chaos of the evening's terror. Though she found herself unable to focus fully on the emotional weight of the declaration, given everything else demanding her attention in that fraught moment. "What will you do?" she asked instead. "Whatever proves necessary to guarantee your safety permanently," Killian said. "I will personally lead a force to root out whatever remains of Dorian's influence beyond our borders, and I will ensure, through whatever means required, that this particular threat never again reaches close enough to touch you or Wolf." His resolve, though comforting in its fierce protectiveness, filled Elena with a new kind of worry entirely. A fear, not for herself or Wolf, but for Killian himself, should he choose to personally confront whatever dangerous remnants still lurked beyond the territory's protective borders. She said nothing of this fear that night, too exhausted and shaken to fully articulate it, but it lingered in her thoughts long after Killian had finally coaxed her back into a fitful, wary sleep. Wolf held securely between them for the remainder of the night. Killian departed 3 days later, at the head of a carefully chosen force of 20 trusted guards, their destination the remote border settlement, where investigations had traced the hired intruder's payment, a place called Ravenscroft, that existed in the lawless margins between 3 separate territories, each too weak, individually, to enforce meaningful order over the settlement's criminal elements. Elena watched him prepare for departure with a knot of anxiety lodged firmly in her chest, though she forced herself to remain outwardly composed, understanding that her fear would only add to the burden he already carried. "You'll send word the moment it's safe to do so," she said, more instruction than question, as he checked the fastenings on his traveling gear one final time in the estate's main courtyard. "I will," Killian promised, reaching to gently cup her face in his hands, "and I'll return as quickly as circumstances allow. This isn't a mission I intend to draw out longer than absolutely necessary." "Be careful," Elena said, her voice catching slightly despite her efforts at composure. "Wolf and I need you to come back safely, not just successfully." Killian's expression softened at her words, and he pressed a lingering kiss to her forehead, before pulling back to meet her eyes directly. "I have every reason in the world to return safely, Elena. You and Wolf are that reason. I won't take unnecessary risks." He departed with his forces shortly after, and Elena spent the following days in a state of anxious waiting that reminded her uncomfortably of her earlier weeks within the estate, before she had grown accustomed to feeling genuinely safe, rather than merely temporarily protected. Celine proved a steady companion throughout this period, keeping Elena occupied with estate matters and reassuring updates whenever scouts returned with news of Killian's progress, though the news itself remained frustratingly sparse, given the remote nature of Ravenscroft's location. Nearly a week into Killian's absence, disturbing news finally arrived, carried by an exhausted scout who had ridden through the night to deliver his report. The settlement at Ravenscroft had proven considerably better defended than initial intelligence suggested, its criminal network having anticipated potential retaliation and fortified their position accordingly. Killian's forces had engaged in direct confrontation upon arrival, successfully overwhelming the settlement's defenses, but not without casualties on both sides, and Killian himself had sustained injuries during the fighting, though the scout could not provide details on their severity. Elena's world narrowed sharply upon hearing this news, fear for Killian's safety eclipsing every other concern that had occupied her thoughts during his absence. "How badly is he hurt?" she demanded, gripping the scout's arm, perhaps more forcefully than necessary in her desperation for information. "I don't know precisely, my lady," the scout admitted, using a title Elena had not yet grown accustomed to hearing applied to herself. He remained conscious and continued directing operations even after sustaining injury, but the healers accompanying our forces insisted on treating him before allowing further exertion. He should return within 2 days, provided his condition doesn't worsen during travel. Those 2 days stretched interminably for Elena, her anxiety compounding with each passing hour, despite Celine's steady reassurances and her own attempts to occupy herself with Wolf's care and estate responsibilities that had increasingly begun falling to her during Killian's absence. She barely slept, barely ate, her mind consumed entirely with worry for the man who had become, over these past months, the anchor around which her entire sense of safety and belonging had come to revolve. When Killian's forces finally returned, 2 days later, exactly as the scout had promised, Elena rushed to the estate's main gate the moment word reached her of their approach. Wolf balanced on her hip, despite her own trembling anxiety. She spotted Killian immediately among the returning riders, his arm bound in a sling, his face pale but alert, and relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled beneath its weight. "Killian," she called out, unable to contain herself despite the formal atmosphere surrounding his return, rushing forward the moment he dismounted, careful of his injured arm, as she wrapped her free arm around him in a fierce embrace. "I told you I would return," he murmured against her hair, his uninjured arm coming around to hold her and Wolf both close against him, though perhaps not in quite the condition I had hoped. "You're hurt," Elena said, pulling back to examine the sling and the various bruises visible along his jaw and neck, her earlier relief giving way to fresh concern. "A wound to my shoulder, nothing that won't heal fully with proper rest," Killian assured her, though the tightness around his eyes suggested the injury pained him more than his casual dismissal indicated. "Ravenscroft's network has been thoroughly dismantled. Every remaining associate connected to Dorian's original operation has been detained or eliminated. This particular threat, I can promise you with certainty, has finally ended." Relief and lingering worry warred within Elena's chest as she absorbed this news, grateful beyond measure that the danger threatening her family had genuinely concluded, yet troubled by the visible cost Killian had paid to secure that safety. "At what price to yourself?" she said quietly, reaching to gently touch the edge of his bandaged shoulder. "A price I would pay again without hesitation. For your safety and Wolf's," Killian said simply, his amber eyes holding hers with unwavering sincerity. "You are worth considerably more to me than any wound I might sustain protecting you." Celine, who had joined the gathering crowd welcoming the returning forces, cleared her throat pointedly, drawing both their attention. "Perhaps this reunion could continue somewhere more private and considerably more comfortable for a man who has just ridden 2 days with a healing shoulder wound," she suggested, though warmth colored her usually businesslike tone. Killian's answering laugh, though slightly strained by his injury, carried genuine warmth, and he allowed Elena to guide him toward the estate's healing quarters for proper attention to his wound. Wolf, reaching curiously toward his father figure's bandaged arm, with the innocent fascination of a child too young to understand the gravity of what that injury represented. Over the following days, as Killian's shoulder gradually healed under careful attention, Elena found herself reflecting deeply on everything they had endured together since that first terrible night at the market, on the remarkable transformation her life had undergone, from desperate isolation to genuine belonging, protected not merely by circumstance, but by a man who had proven, time and again through both words and costly action, the depth of his commitment to her and her son's well-being. The threat that had shadowed their happiness for so many months had finally, truly ended, and as Elena watched Killian slowly regain his strength over the following weeks, watched Wolf's delighted laughter whenever his favorite adult carefully lifted him despite his healing injury, she allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to believe in the permanence of the peace they had fought so hard to secure. Spring arrived across the territory, with a warmth that seemed to mirror the settled peace that had finally taken root within Killian's estate. Wildflowers spreading across the hillsides surrounding the stronghold in vibrant patches of color, the air carrying the sweet scent of blossoms through open windows each morning. Killian's shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a thin scar as evidence of the battle at Ravenscroft, and the household had settled into a rhythm of genuine contentment that felt worlds removed from the fear and uncertainty that had once dominated Elena's every waking thought. It was on one such peaceful morning that Killian called for a formal gathering of his full council, along with representatives from neighboring territories and prominent members of the surrounding villages, an announcement that stirred considerable curiosity throughout the estate, given the unusual scope of those invited to attend. Elena, informed only that her presence was requested without further explanation, found herself dressing that morning with a peculiar flutter of anticipation she could not entirely explain. Celine assisting with unusual care in preparing an elegant gown Elena had not previously seen among her belongings. "Killian had this made for you," Celine explained, smoothing the fine fabric across Elena's shoulders with evident satisfaction. "He wanted today to be memorable." "What exactly is happening today?" Elena asked, her earlier curiosity sharpening into genuine suspicion, given Celine's carefully evasive expression. "That's for Killian to explain," Celine said, though the barely suppressed smile tugging at her lips suggested she knew considerably more than she was willing to reveal. "Come, the council chamber awaits, and Wolf has already been dressed in his own finest clothes, courtesy of the same tailor." Elena's unease mingled with growing anticipation as she made her way toward the estate's grand hall. Wolf held securely in her arms, dressed adorably in a small formal outfit that made her heart swell with tender pride, despite her continued uncertainty about the day's purpose. The hall, when she entered, proved considerably more crowded than she had anticipated, filled not only with Killian's full council, but also with representatives she recognized from neighboring territories, along with numerous villagers she had come to know during her months within the estate, including Ivy and several other survivors from the original market, who had traveled considerable distances to attend whatever this gathering entailed. Killian stood at the front of the hall, dressed in formal attire befitting his position as Alpha King, his expression carrying a mixture of nervousness and determination that Elena had rarely witnessed from him during even the most challenging moments of their shared trials. When their eyes met across the crowded hall, something in his expression softened with unmistakable warmth, and he gestured for her to approach, the assembled crowd parting respectfully to allow her passage toward the front of the chamber. "Elena," Killian began, once she had reached his side, his voice carrying easily through the hushed, attentive hall. "Months ago, I stepped into a market, intending only to gather evidence against corruption within my own council. I did not expect, in doing so, to find someone who would come to mean more to me than I believed possible. Someone whose courage and strength have inspired not only my own continued efforts against exploitation within this territory, but the hope of every survivor who has found safety because of the changes we've fought to secure together." Elena felt her breath catch, understanding beginning to dawn, even before Killian lowered himself carefully onto one knee before her, drawing an audible gasp from the assembled crowd, followed by a ripple of delighted murmuring that spread quickly through the hall. "I am asking you, before this council, and before witnesses who understand precisely what we have overcome together, to become my Luna," Killian continued, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his expression. "Not merely as protection I offer you, but as an equal partner in building a territory where no mother ever again faces the choice you once faced, where every child grows up as safely and freely as I intend for Wolf to grow, as my son, in every way that matters, regardless of blood." Tears blurred Elena's vision as the full weight of his words settled over her, the acknowledgement of Wolf not merely as a child under his protection, but as a son claimed fully, and without hesitation, alongside the proposal of partnership that recognized her not as someone rescued, but as someone whose strength had earned genuine, equal standing beside him. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with overwhelming emotion. "Yes, absolutely yes." The hall erupted into cheers and applause as Killian rose to gather her, and Wolf, into an embrace that spoke more eloquently than any further words could manage, the assembled crowd celebrating not merely the joining of two individuals, but the culmination of a journey that had transformed corruption into justice, fear into safety, and isolation into a family bound together through courage, shared struggle, and hard-won trust. In the months that followed, as preparations for their formal joining ceremony proceeded, amid the continued work of rebuilding trust and justice throughout the territory, Elena often found herself reflecting on the terrified young woman who had once stood on a market platform, believing she was about to lose everything that mattered to her. That woman could not have imagined the path that lay ahead, could not have foreseen that the very worst night of her life would ultimately lead toward a future built on genuine partnership, protection freely given rather than reluctantly endured, and a family created not through obligation, but through the deepest kind of chosen love. Wolf grew steadily throughout that year, thriving under the combined care of a mother whose fierce love had never wavered, and a father whose strength had proven itself, time and again, in service of protection rather than exploitation. The territory itself continued transforming under their combined leadership. Old debts and manufactured obligations that had once trapped vulnerable Omegas within cycles of exploitation gradually dismantled through careful policy and unwavering enforcement. ensuring that no mother within their borders would ever again face the terrible choice that had once brought Elena to that ruined mill's terrible platform. On the day of their formal joining ceremony, held beneath the same spreading trees where Elena and Killian had spent countless quiet evenings building the trust and affection that had ultimately grown into genuine love, Elena stood surrounded by the community that had welcomed her so completely. Wolf held between them, as Killian formally claimed them both before the assembled territory as his Luna and his son. The ceremony marked not merely the joining of their family, but the true beginning of a new chapter for the entire territory, one built on the hard-won understanding that true strength lay not in exploiting the vulnerable, but in standing fiercely, unwaveringly, in their defense. As the celebration continued long into that warm evening, laughter and music filling the estate grounds where fear had once cast long, terrible shadows, Elena found herself standing quietly beside Killian, watching Wolf take his increasingly steady steps across the grass, while surrounded by the family and community they had built together, through shared courage and hard-won trust. Whatever challenges the future might yet bring, she understood now, with a certainty that had once seemed impossible for someone in her circumstances to ever feel, that she would face them, not alone, but surrounded by love, protected not through mere charity, but through genuine, equal partnership, finally and completely free of the shadows that had once threatened to consume everything she held most dear.